All right. So thank you all for coming today on this Friday afternoon. And I'm really very enthusiastic about our panel today. Before I get into that, I want to just remind everyone that this webinar is part of a series that we've strived to do starting during the pandemic, is to offer these webinars to hear from fellow social science faculty and instructors on what's working for them. We aim to do about 1 to 2 per quarter. So if this sounds like something you'd like to present on, please, by all means, reach out and let me know, let Jeanette know. And we would love to hear from you. So, but our focus today is on crafting assignments for writing courses. And our panelists today have quite a bit of experience between them on this very topic, which is why we paired them together. They both teach upper division writing courses in the social sciences, among other courses, and they have some novel practices for their writing assignments. I think you'll be very surprised at some of their findings. So, panelists always enjoy hearing your comments and questions. It's nice to know that we're not speaking to the void. So just as with your students, you'd like to hear from them. So please feel free to use the chat room or the chat box, or to unmute yourself when it's appropriate to ask a question. All right, so I'd like to introduce the panelists now. We're going to hear from Caitlin Finley. She received her PhD from UCI in political science, and she now teaches courses in both political science and global and international studies. And then we have Bill Dewan, who has his PhD from the University of New Mexico, and he teaches courses in social science and with an emphasis on anthropology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to kick things off.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for putting this together. And hello, everyone. Thanks for attending here on this Friday afternoon. So as Janet mentioned, I'm Bill Dewan. I've been at UCI teaching since 2015. As she said, I came from New Mexico for my PhD in American Studies. And yeah, so I teach in 172 AW, upper division writing course, and also some 189 courses and some strange subjects. Supernatural folklore, there's a class on UFOs, conspiracy theories. And as you might imagine, some of the stuff is seemingly exotic in a lot of ways, but still and very much pertinent to what is going on in the world around us. So today, what I want to do is just briefly talk with you about an assignment that I use for my supernatural folklore class that I found to be something that is pretty unique, something that students probably aren't as familiar with or used to, but that the response has been overwhelmingly positive in doing that. So what I'll do is I just want to share my screen with you here, and just I promise just a handful of PowerPoints to give you a visual aid as to what I'm talking about. I'll just kind of go over the basics of it, my goals for it, some of my approaches, and then share briefly with you sort of an anonymous sample student submission to give you an idea of the end product. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So for this project, I'm sharing something that I developed specifically for my supernatural folklore course, Social Science 189. And the entire course itself is really designed to help students with their academic writing, as well as qualitative research skills to help develop them. And we kind of do this through this fun, admittedly spooky activity. So broadly, this is a course that's examining how conceptions of the supernatural, or you might say paranormal, differ in Western societies versus other cultures around the world, but also how within the United States, the supernatural exists as kind of this third space between competing epistemologies, especially like mainstream religions with science as a discipline and practice. So the biggest goal for the course overall, I want students to think about comparing and contrasting like supernatural beliefs from the past and the present. But in doing that, I want them to draw from anthropological approaches, sociological, psychological, and folkloric, like theoretical orientations. And in doing so, to examine the structures and the functions of supernatural belief systems. So in doing so, I want them to apply those skills they learn in the course and in the process of collecting and evaluating supernatural narratives from their own communities. So that's really what this project is all about. Now, one of the biggest challenges for students in this kind of class, and we can maybe talk about some of this later on, is to get them to move past like the veracity, you'd say, of supernatural experiences that people have or stories. They're naturally excited and it also encouraged to talk about ghost stories or psychic phenomena or Bigfoot or UFOs or what may have you. But again, the purpose of the course is to equip them with the skills to explore how these kinds of beliefs are established and disseminated within our communities, and then how we collectively assign them various forms and functions and cultural values. So they're expected to do all of this in this final project, kind of the summation of all we learn in there, but it's a project that is ongoing throughout the quarter. So it requires them to collect a series of supernatural narratives from their communities and then analyze those accounts using the theoretical tools and concepts we develop in the course. So you can see listed here, you have these three basic requirements. I start them, of course, they have to have an introductory statement for their project. That includes, you see like a one or mostly 2-page statement describing the process that they go through in compiling this project, including things that worked for them and did not work for them, things that they found especially challenging, fascinating, but also it's meant to have them reflect on some of the key topics and themes that helped aid in their understanding of these accounts. And of course, the heart of this, though, are going to be those 4 personally collected narratives. I used to have them collect more than that, but I found that workload to be a bit too burdensome. So I settled on 4. These are 4 personally collected supernatural accounts from 4 separate individuals. And of course, that also includes accompanying narrative analysis. So each one, they're expected to provide a lot of information. That includes basic background information, including the person, of course, they collect the narrative from. And then when it applies, where maybe that person first got the story from. So I asked them to make a concerted effort in the process to do some more research and looking into the narrative's origins. And that's done through a consultation of class readings as well as their own research into that. But I also asked them to discuss what characteristics make it classified into a certain narrative category. So we talk about narrative classifications and their different uses and how they can interact with each other, one, and sort of building community folklore. So these things like legends, memories, and fabulous. And so I want them to identify and locate what types of accounts that these things in fact are. Now, the narrative itself is also a part of the project. I don't ask them to basically provide transcripts of these interviews that they conduct with people. That's more of like a summary of the accounts people provide to them. But then once again, ask them, can we locate folk parallels and narrative traditions in the content and readings that we have in our class? But the most important thing here is going to be the analysis component of that. And so this is the most challenging for them. So this includes multiple pages. I think I have listed here at least 2. In a standard type essay format, we're talking at least 3, though, quite typically 3 full pages of analysis for each of these stories that they collect. That's going to include basic background and demographic information. So we talk a lot about demographics in the class. One of our key readings for the course looks at surveys of supernatural beliefs and experiences in American society. So they're asked to match those up with the predictors of belief that the authors did find. But then also thinking about how the narratives fit our course themes in general, why the storytellers might find these accounts to be believable, of course, how it resonates with them, the meanings they derive from them, prior attitudes that their respondents might have about the supernatural, and then how this story may reinforce those beliefs or maybe alter it in some ways, as they often do. The setting for those interviews, and also the performance. So we talk about performance of narrative as much as we do just the actual text and content within, which can be at times another challenge for them. So all of this stuff is really sort of the bulk of the assignment there, and thinking about how to properly analyze these stories in this way. Now the assignment it's worth a big chunk of their grade in the course. It's 40%. It's always due at the very end of the quarter. So because of that and its importance, I speak to them about it every class, and I make regular announcements about it on our Canvas page as well. But even doing that, unfortunately, some students' analyses in the end was going to struggle to expand outside of their, individual embrace or skepticism, as it may be, of those accounts. Like a lot of them get stuck on, is it real or not? That's one of the hardest things to get them to really shift away from. So in the past, also a lot of students, as many of you are probably aware, no matter what you say to them, they're never really going to set aside enough time to properly work on these things. So I try my hardest to really kind of hammer that point home about time management. And over the years, because of that, I've kind of really overhauled project guidelines and instructions. So again, I try to establish upfront a clear timeline. You can kind of see some of this listed here about expectations about where they should be at in the process. So weekly reminders of completion is something that I really try to emphasize here. I talk about, of course, the interview process at first. It's the first thing they're really going to have to do, including stressing the importance of things like informed consent, maintaining people's anonymity, of course, and respecting the people themselves, the time that they're sharing with them, and their narratives themselves. And then we move to talking about the actual process of interviewing too, including we talk about tips and strategies, the do's and don'ts of these interviews, as well as providing them with a list of core questions they should come into the interviews armed with and talking to their respondents. And so the interview process for them is almost always the most fun. But it can be like the first part can be something they're very reluctant to get into. It's like, I don't know anybody who has a ghost story. I say, yes, you do, and you'll find out quite a bit, very quickly. So that process, once they get the ball rolling, they really seem to enjoy that. And most of their struggles then ultimately are in the writing process and in the analysis. So that's where I think a big chunk of the work goes. And at times this class, the enrollment numbers can be high. It can be, over 100. And that can be a challenge in the past for me to mandate them providing drafts at any moment in time for us to review and have them revise. So, I was talking earlier with Caitlin about this issue. The challenge of making like a first draft mandatory, given the size of a given class and given the time constraints that I would have or a TA might have. So that's something maybe for us to discuss. I'd like to find a way to make this mandatory for them to do and be able to sit down with each student and do that. But depending on the number of students, that can be, daunting at times. So I've also developed a popular active learning activity that's done in class. It's essentially a storytelling session where students will volunteer to share their own supernatural accounts in front of the rest of the class. Now, I get the ball rolling in that class session by I start sharing accounts. I'll tell stories that maybe I've collected in the past in my own research, or I'll share a supernatural account of my own. And this is, of course, so the entire group of students is then encouraged to listen and then start to, modeling after their own projects, begin to ask me a series of questions. Okay, and so this is really helping them, I think, and the feedback has been good on this, to actually figure out, okay, this is what we're looking for, this process of the interview, this is what what we're looking for, what we're not looking for here, and learning follow-up questions to really get at the core of how these narratives function. So after I share my stories and we go into the Q&A back and forth, then other students in the class will then step forward and then begin sharing their own stories. And at that point, the floodgates open and everyone will want to share a story, quite often in past experience there. But of course, the important part is, what questions are we asking here to really really solidify our research and our analysis. So I think that process really helps them get a better handle on the interview, but also the expectations for the content too. Well, it's a fun activity. they really, really enjoy hearing other people's ghost stories, Bigfoot stories, psychic experiences, whatever it may be too. So it's a fun activity in that regard. But as far as the final projects go, their feedback, has been very positive, and most of the students ultimately express genuine surprise at the sheer number of supernatural narratives that surround them effectively, and of course the cultural importance and values that the people they know derive from them. And there's still a number of problems to iron out, and we can talk about that too. But I think as an added bonus, again, these are really fun to grade as well. At the end of the quarter, it's not like a kind of regular final exam. It's like, all right, it is story time, and oh, look at all of these really strange, interesting, fascinating accounts that students have collected, from their communities, including from around the world. So it's a really neat, fun process, and I think a lot of students, at the end are like, hey, this is really memorable for me. I had no idea about any of this stuff until we conducted this kind of project. And so to give you maybe I guess a quick example of what a finished product looks like, I wanted to share you quickly a sample of one student submission from last year. Okay, so just very quickly, I just want to show, and I encourage students to be as creative with this or as boring as they want. And the students kind of taken, kind of a middle ground. You can see it's kind of, in some ways, it's a traditional response here, and they of course divided it up into certain sections. You can see the student's introductory statement talking about, this process that they went through in collecting the narrative itself. And then of course it continues. And a bit unconventional, they decided it's easier for them, but also for their project, to lay some key definitions out at the beginning, and talking about some of the sources, of course, they're drawing from, and talking about the elements. They talk about definitions of types of supernatural narratives. And then some of the things that we get into with our core readings, with the ideas of supernatural generalists and particularists, and how their respondents might fit into certain categories, as well as storytelling strategies that we review in course, and things to look out for in the interview process. So this student decided to lay some of these basics out at the beginning of the project before diving into each narrative. So you can see here, in this case, this student is interviewing someone who has a story coming from Mexico, and giving a bit of a basic background into the family and the demographics that are there. And then as we see this going further, see a type of narrative that's located there. They provide storyteller demographics. Then they get into the analysis portion there. And of course, in drawing from course readings and concepts along the way, especially our main essay. So again, just give you a real chance, and I don't want to take up too much time here, but you can see how in-depth the analysis goes for the student's portion, and thinking about linking, of course, the narrative itself to some of the strategies and concepts within the class. And so the student in particular did a very, very good job of incorporating it throughout their essay. So again, they go from the content of the story, the demographic analysis they include there, and then of course, getting into the next one. So this is an example of, like, I think, a well-done project that's really strives to get at everything I'm asking for with it. And again, we can get into issues that still arise with them, but just wanted to share with you one sort of fun, non-traditional writing activity that my students really seem to enjoy. So I'll turn this over to Caitlin.
All right, thank you, Bill. I just wanted to follow up with some questions for you. One is, I noticed in your course that there's a lot to cover here. So interviewing techniques, students need a theoretical understanding of the content here, as well as how to write. And so how do you balance all of those goals in a very limited time framework of 10-week quarter?
I mean, that's a really good question, and that's a tricky process because this is a project that asks them to take on a lot. And along the way, there are 2 other writing assignments that are required. They're basically standard reading responses that they're all required during the quarter. And so that's helping them, of course, think about how to draw from them in their analyses. But there's so much for them, to cover with a project, which is why I really try to start with the interview process itself early on before moving to these other areas. But it's not always a smooth transition, because they'll have, some students will wait weeks to do their interviews. And some students will have, major questions and concerns about, okay, which readings make sense for me to draw from for which areas. So I think the hardest part is getting the interview process ironed out, helping them find people to interview. It can be a challenge as well too. So you have to go over that. And then I think, but as I said before, that the major issue then becomes, all right, the writing itself. So it is a lot to juggle. And it's like I consider even like maybe reducing some of the other writing assignments as a result. But I think that the reason I like it is sort of like it's a totality of everything I want them to get from the course in the end. And it oftentimes works, but sometimes it doesn't.
Well, it sounds like the skills you're teaching mutually reinforce one another. And so, students are treated as whole people in their skill development.
Yeah, and of course, when we talk about these are some of the things that because writing, of course, is a huge part of it. But I think for a lot of students, this is a unique opportunity for them to try other things, in terms of in this academic setting with qualitative research. And it happens to, I think the best thing is it's a fun thing to write about, interview people for. It's not, we're not talking about, health narratives or whatever. We're talking about, okay, campfire stories. Yeah. But of course that can have its drawback because they can get caught up in the story itself and rather than the analysis, but it's meant to be a fun introduction into exploring these other aspects of the social sciences.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing you pointed to was kind of this issue of kind of managing the workload. And that's something that I often struggle with writing courses and courses that may not be designated as writing courses, but have big writing components. How do you kind of work with your teaching assistants to manage the workload and, again, giving comments back, kind of walking students through this process?
Yeah, so that's one of the biggest challenges, and I'm curious to hear maybe some of your recommendations, or even for everyone else that's here listening, because depending on the number of students in the class, there's only so much time that I have or a TA has to actually sit down with them. So I basically tell them I strongly encourage you, but don't mandate that you provide me, of course, with at least one sample. So I say, don't give me the entire draft of your project. Give me one narrative analysis that we can sit down, go over what looks good, what needs work, suggestions for readings to incorporate in there, or even follow-up questions to go back, and then review. Because I say with all of them, the interview process, there'll be something that comes to mind for your analysis that you didn't actually get to in the initial interview. So this is a chance for us to review stuff and say, oh, even in an email exchange, you can go back and ask a person, this kind of follow-up stuff. So I try to make them sit down occasions, but again, there's only so much time we have. So I recommend at the very least 2 weeks before the end of the quarter, everyone has sent me at least via email one sample narrative or for a TA. And I'd say the success rate of that has been at best 50%, but closer to 40% of the class. So
that's still half,
Okay, yeah.
half full, half empty. Yeah, just to make a plug for this, I know the campus, the Office of the Campus Writing Coordinator does host quarterly sessions on training faculty and TAs on how to give comments back on student writing. And I always advertise that to my teaching assistants. It's a great 1 hour training where they really kind of emphasize, don't spend so much time on the nitpicky grammar mechanics, really focus on, when you're giving comments back on content, things that, students can actually change in their writing moving forward in the course.
Right. And that's an important point too. And of course, different students, different, writing levels and experience there. And so, yeah, we try to work on, of course, the mechanics as much as possible. For this kind of assignment, I'm like, I really want to, the most important thing is, can you communicate to us, the concepts and core ideas and examples effectively in writing, through this project. So, using a colon versus semicolon kind of stuff. Yeah, that can, enter into the fray, but I'm much more concerned, of course, with the latter. So.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing you just mentioned is this fact that our students come to us from very different starting points. Some are native speakers, some are not. Some came from very well-resourced high schools where, the student teacher ratio was small and teachers could give comments back, some didn't. How do you deal with this challenge of students coming from very different points, but yet the expectations are the same?
That's tough. That's tricky. In terms of one question students will ask, well, for social sciences, what style do you prefer that we use? And for the upper level 172 AW advanced writing class, it's APA. This is the class itself is learning, how to write in APA style. For this assignment, say, well, depending on your major, which one are you most familiar with and comfortable with? So whether it be APA or something like, within Chicago style, MLA, I think it's like, to me, that's less important for this as long as they're consistent, especially when it comes to things like citations. But yeah, the students are coming from a variety of a lot of social science majors, but not all. And different amount of experience, in writing assignments, and it's an unconventional assignment anyways. So I try not to harp on that too much. But yeah, that's why my focus is more on, can you communicate to me, in writing some of these core ideas in your analysis. So that's why I say focus on that.
Yeah, and in some ways, what I really like about your assignment, this kind of emphasis on storytelling. That's something we all kind of have an experience with, regardless of our background. And so you're able to kind of scaffold on top of every student's experience there.
Yeah.
Great. Last question I had for you is, coming out of the pandemic, we've had lots of lessons learned. It kind of forced a lot of us to reevaluate our teaching. What were some lessons learned, particularly with regards to teaching writing, or even kind of in how you've changed this particular assignment?
Yeah, this was an assignment that I was curious, moving to remote learning, how things might pan out. And I think that in some ways, it worked out really well for this type of assignment, just because of the technology that we have access to. So for a lot of students, they were already at that time comfortable, relatively speaking, using Zoom, and making them come to. I mean, I did live Zoom lectures for this class before because I really wanted them to be there with me, especially when it comes to like a storytelling type session where we can all just in a room like this, one person at a time, share stories, and then either in the chat, because some students are really uncomfortable speaking, in front of others in class or even over Zoom. So I think
particularly in a 100-person class.
Yeah, and so the chat option there, I think, really worked to its benefit. So I think both the lecture interactions, but also with their actual assignment itself, they found it so much easier in some ways and more comfortable to interview people in that format. And they still get the visual component. Because some of them say, like, can we do like an email exchange with people? And I said, well, how we tell stories is very nonverbal as well too, and those are part of the cues they want people to pick up on too. So it's not as perfect as the face-to-face interaction, but still via Zoom, you can still see how we communicate stories in these very rich ways. So
yeah,
and that worked out well. Yeah.
I noticed one of my students was saying that she felt like she was most active in class during this remote transition because she felt like it kind of put her self-consciousness aside. And so it was really interesting to see kind of how you get more voices in some ways via Zoom than in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was great for a lot of students, and some of them treated it like it was Reddit, not gonna lie. But, most of them, respectful and understood this as sort of being a, professional academic setting. So I think overall, I mean, I still love and prefer face-to-face teaching. But I think for this kind of class, this kind of assignment, I think it worked out pretty well.
Great.
So Bill, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Let's see. Jacob is commenting on the formatting of that student example that you showed us. And he wonders, did you find that allowing students to be creative helped engage them more in the work?
Yeah, I mean, for some of them, it was almost daunting when I told them to be as creative as possible. But I always tell them you can be as creative or boring as you like. As long as, when I give them that kind of checklist, as long as you include all of this in here, that's what I'm most concerned. And then don't use like a weird like font that I can't read, on my screen. Some have gotten as creative as wanted to do like the entire thing like as a video, which is very, very labor intensive for them. And even with those assignments, I'm like, well, I'm going to need some sort of text portion in here, to examine your analysis. But some of them find it very, very liberating. There are some students that are they're not used to having that kind of freedom with a project that's worth this amount of their grade there. So there's more of a meet with me frequently. Is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? So it's I think you get a bit of both. But overall, I think most of the students really seem to enjoy, being able, and including visual aids and stuff in there as well too. Some make it like an investigative X-Files series of folders, things. So it's really neat to see what they come up with.
Nice. All right, Jordan has a question. He asks, did you build this assignment off of older assignments, previous professors or courses? Because it would be nice to know if you changed something that led to better learning outcomes.
Yes. So the core idea actually came from the urban legends class, which I also teach. But when I was teaching a version of this years ago, it was recommended by another instructor. And in my own folklore classes, when I was an undergrad and then a grad student, about of course the importance of storytelling and narratives. And so back then, that was when I first realized that storytelling isn't just so much about the narrative itself. It's also in how we communicate our narratives effectively to other people. So that professor really kind of gave me this idea of developing a project or a portfolio in which students really interacted with people in their communities to really get a sense of the folklore that surround us and the folklore that impacts our lives. And so from that that basic suggestion there, it really was years of development. I mentioned before that I used to require like 8 stories for them to collect, and that was just way too daunting a work, and it made their analysis, I think, a bit more superficial as a result. I then just decided I wanted to include more focus or emphasis on the storytelling tactics and the communication, because a lot of students would kind of fall back into just text exchanges with people, email exchanges, counting those as interviews in some ways. I made the requirement to talk to 4 different people, versus getting all stories from grandma, and so in a number of ways, it's been adjusted to make it easier for them to understand what I want from them, to try to give them more guidance, give them more of a deadlines, for certain things where they should be at in the process there. And there still are bumps in there for me to work on. So it has been a long a gradual process in writing at this point.
All right, thanks for that, Bill. Those are the questions in the chat. Turn it back to you, Caitlin.
All right, so let me share my screen. Oops. Okay. So I teach courses in global and international studies, political science, and then social sciences. Here I'm going to be honing in on kind of a capstone assignment in one of my upper division writing courses that's housed in global and international studies. And this course focuses on cases of international conflict. And students learn about different cases of conflict, as well as different theories about how and why conflicts escalate, how they become violent, and then how ultimately they de-escalate. How do we get to peace agreements and ultimately reconciliation? And in this process, they write a policy brief in which they, whoops, let me move to, they investigate a problem related to a case of conflict, and there are 4 cases that they can choose from. So they look at a specific problem with it, whether it's regarding, refugee or displacement issues. It could be looking at access to water, a number of different kinds of problems. They describe that problem, explain its causes and consequences, and then look at kind of what can we do about it. So what are some policy options that can solve this particular problem? So again, if we're looking at, there's not enough water, what are some policies that we can come up with to tackle that particular problem? and then they describe and evaluate those policies and ultimately come forward with a recommendation for a decision maker. This assignment is kind of completed through a series of chunks, and this I found is really valuable, is not just kind of giving an entire assignment and kind of bam, work through it, but really kind of introducing it in small pieces, and that's become a lot more digestible than, again, kind of just putting forth one big assignment. And so they write this assignment, again, through different sections. They start with different sections. The whole paper includes an abstract, introduction, problem description, policy options section, and then, again, ultimately a conclusion or recommendations. But they do write this through kind of looking at the different sections. And they start with the problem description because you can't put forth solutions if you don't know what the problem is. So I have them actually start kind of in the middle here, describing a problem, then coming forward with solutions. And then at the end of the term, they do kind of the abstract, intro, and conclusion, which are kind of summaries, which is a little bit weird for them because they kind of are used to starting with the introduction and then moving forward with the rest of their paper. But I found with kind of, again, focusing on the meat of the paper, what your content is first, before you start looking at the introduction and conclusion, is really helpful in developing their thinking and their ideas. One thing I've learned in teaching this course and this assignment is that it's helpful to develop kind of precursor assignments. And so I started this when my first time teaching this course, everything was kind of geared towards the policy brief. And so again, they were kind of finding a problem related to their case of conflict and putting forth solutions. In reading through some of these policy briefs, though, it became just glaringly apparent that they didn't understand the background conflict to begin with. So I was getting, descriptions of problems related to water in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but the students didn't really understand the background of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so this was kind of a red flag to me that I need to scaffold this assignment much better. The students first need to understand the context of their conflict before they can look more deeply at a particular policy problem related to that conflict. And so I developed a kind of a precursor assignment to the policy brief where students have to first explain or summarize what happened in their case of conflict. How did violence emerge? How did the conflict escalate? And then again, what are some efforts to make peace and de-escalate the conflict? And I found that this background assignment has been really just huge in developing their abilities to tackle the kind of capstone assignment. One thing that I also do with this assignment is there's a very heavy emphasis on drafting. And again, this comes in an upper division writing course. I do have teaching assistants. This is roughly a 60-person course. And so I have 2 teaching assistants. And so that's also really helpful as far as kind of allowing students to get into the drafting process, which is ultimately part of writing. Nobody produces a perfect document right on their first try. And so we shouldn't expect our students to do that. Many of us in our own research have received those revise and resubmit. So why would we expect our students to do it perfectly if we don't do it perfectly? So again, drafting is really a huge part of the writing process. So students begin by drafting, again, the meat of the paper, first the problem description and then the policy options. And I have them first submit it to their peers, and they go through a peer review exercise first. And then after getting feedback from their peers, they make revisions. And then they start submitting it to their teaching assistant for a grade. And this is this is a draft grade, but I found that having the teaching assistants grade a draft is really important because one, when the student sees that there's a grade associated with the assignment, they're going to put a lot more effort into it. And two, again, this is part of the writing process. This opportunity for them to get feedback from the teaching assistants is critical. So they get feedback from the TAs with their draft. And then they revise based on the TA's feedback on this draft. And then they kind of compile all of their revised drafts into a fully revised paper. So all of the sections at this point, and then they submit that to their peers first, and then they get feedback from their peers. They make revisions again, and then they submit everything to the teaching assistants for a grade during finals week. So there is this, again, there's a very heavy emphasis on drafting, which is how we learn. We get feedback from others, and then we incorporate that feedback in making changes. Some lessons learned in kind of developing this assignment and teaching this course with it is, again, one thing is just to be mindful of assumptions of what students know going into the course. This was a key thing for me in kind of learning that I need to scaffold this assignment much better, where students didn't really understand the background context of their conflict, and yet they were still writing about it. And so here I developed kind of these, again, precursor assignments, this conflict summary assignment, so that students really were equipped with the knowledge that they needed to begin their policy brief assignment. The other thing is just kind of being very explicit in my instruction and offering opportunities to practice writing. So here, the genre of writing I'm asking students to write is a policy brief. And this is very different from what they're used to writing. In a lot of their kind of writing intensive courses were courses they took as a freshman, in Hume Corps or even as a community college student, and that kind of 5-paragraph essay from humanities is not the same kind of writing that they would do in a policy brief. And so here I ask them to complete other low stakes writing assignments, kind of reflections on the assigned readings, which are not a big portion of the course grade, but opportunities to kind of practice writing concisely for a policy audience. Not like a full page paragraph, but again, kind of shorter paragraphs where topic sentences have very concise, clear arguments. That's something that they're not always assuming is necessary in this genre of writing, and it really gets them to again practice so that the policy brief is a much more polished product, and ultimately hits what I'm looking for. Other things that I've learned is students generally write very poor quality papers at the last minute and late at night. And so this is where I think drafting really helps, is because it forces them to do at least something before they get a grade, get an evaluation on the assignment. And so this is kind of, they turn it in first to their peers, and that forces them to think at least a little bit before they turn it in for a grade to the teaching assistants. So again, I think part of it is kind of forcing them not to do it at the last minute. Another thing that I've done to help with this is I do offer a point of extra credit for taking their writing to the writing center for feedback. And this, the writing center closes at a certain time. I think it's 10 o'clock at night or something like that. But at least that they have to prepare something to take it to the writing center. And so that also kind of incentivizes them to put forth at least some kind of a rough draft before they get closer to the deadline. The last thing I hear is I've noticed that evening deadlines tend to work better than morning deadlines because students are just fresher at night. It seems like a lot of our students tend to do work in the evenings, but kind of middle of the night work is not good work. And so kind of where I put deadlines typically is at midnight for big assignments. And so that way, again, they have time after class, they can, think about it in the evenings, but I'm not going to get 2 in the morning writing. So that's also something I've kind of played with different times to set deadlines. The other thing I've noticed is that students don't automatically review comments from instructors or teaching assistants. So it's helpful to try and force them to do this, particularly again in this course. I do a lot of drafting where the teaching assistants do provide feedback and grades on their drafts. And so earlier renditions of this course, I didn't have them kind of reflect on the teaching assistant's comments. And I found that again, teaching assistants started complaining that, these students aren't reading our comments. We're getting the same, mistakes coming at us in the final papers, things that we asked the students to correct early on, they're not doing that. And so one thing that I found to kind of, again, motivate, incentivize students to review TA feedback is to have a kind of a final self-evaluation assignment where where I ask them to reflect on the comments that the teaching assistants have given them throughout the quarter. And so again, this kind of, at least at the end of the quarter, forces them to go back to look at what they've the feedback that they've gotten from the teaching assistants, and then they can incorporate that in their final project before the final project that they submit during finals week. So that's
Caitlin, a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Lots of good, very applicable techniques there. I love your comment about setting the deadline at midnight rather than at 9 a.m.
Yeah. I had it at 9 a.m. and that's I found that did not work well.
Yeah. All right, so two questions popped up. One asks, Faith asks, what sort of feedback are you looking for the TAs to give? And then the follow-up there from Ainsley is, with respect to the peer feedback, do you use a rubric?
Yeah, good. Yeah, both are great questions. So first, with regards to the TA feedback, a lot of in kind of how I coach the TAs is to kind of think about what's absolutely necessary and focus on that first. And so absolutely necessary is generally content. And so if it looks like the student is having really big problems with articulating basic content, then again, to focus their comments on that and not on issues of kind of grammar, sentence structure, even topic sentences, whatever. And so first and foremost is making sure that they have the content down and that the content satisfies their assignment requirements. Then you kind of get into, it's almost like a hierarchy of needs thing. Then you kind of move up into, all right, so if the content is good, do we see clear argumentation? Is the sentence structure good? Do we have topic sentences with arguments, or kind of our paragraphs kind of a garble of, mismatched ideas, but at least the ideas are good. And so then the teaching assistants can kind of hone in on how students are structuring their ideas and their content. And then kind of above that is again, kind of more the nitty gritty grammar, is subject verb agreement good? Is punctuation good? Those kinds of things I'm less concerned with. And again, I'm much more concerned with the content, and then secondary, how do you structure that content? I have started, what I've noticed in a lot of student writing is paragraph structure is a big challenge for many of them, kind of beginning with, again, kind of topic sentences with arguments, and then, everything that follows from that topic sentence should prove that argument. And so early on in the quarter, I also kind of spend a lot of time with them on trying to understand that way of structuring a paragraph. And then the second question I think you were asking was about peer review. One thing with peer review that I've learned is you can't just tell the peers to just, read the paper and tell your peer what they think, what you think about your peer's paper, because everything will come back as, oh, this paper is great, good job. So you really kind of have to motivate peers to think critically about their peers' work, and that's how we benefit, is by pointing out ways to improve. And so I actually put together a questionnaire for peers to fill out about their peers' paper. So the questionnaire is kind of based on the assignment, and it kind of focuses on content first. So, with the problem description, what is the core problem? And the peer has to answer these questions about what they've read. So what do I understand about the problem presented here? What do I understand about the causes of that problem? What do I understand about the consequences of that problem? And the peer kind of frames it in their own words so that then the person who wrote the paper can look back and say, oh, this is not what I was trying to communicate, or this was what I was trying to communicate. And so this kind of structured peer review process is hugely beneficial. And then the peer also kind of reflects on the strengths and weaknesses of the paper. The other thing that I've noticed from peer review, again, in kind of structuring it this way, is it's beneficial for the writer, but it's also beneficial for the peer, because the peer then comes back to me and says, well, I saw this in my peer's paper. Do I need to do that in the assignment? And so it also gives the peers a better sense of where their own work may be lacking.
Sorry, I wanted to ask you a quick question. You're talking about the content portion there. With my class, the question was always like the biggest hurdle for students was getting over the is this story real or not portion.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about policy and getting away from humanities core style writing, when you've got like a controversial topic for students like Israel, Palestine, how do you manage student emotions over that and biases in their writing, in a way that's, I guess gentle, I guess the best way of putting that.
Yeah. And so this is always a challenge. We have students that come from pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian backgrounds. I also cover a conflict between Armenia, Azerbaijan. Southern California has a huge Armenian population. And so a lot of students have a personal connection to the conflict. And to be honest, they do. They oftentimes do struggle to describe the conflict in very neutral terms. One thing that I'm beginning to focus more attention on is kind of helping them understand the connotation of words. And so the word to conquer, or to say conquered a territory, gives a very different connotation than to gain control over a territory. And so kind of working with them on this key issue of learning what the connotation of certain words is. And so that, I think, has been helpful for the students who come from these conflict zones, and kind of coaching them through that process of discovering the connotation of their language. The flip side, though, is sometimes students who have absolutely no background, no knowledge of the conflict cases I explore, they go on the internet and then they find these very biased sources and they start writing about their cases based on these very biased sources. And so there I've learned that I also have to coach them on kind of understanding the parties to the conflict, particularly the external parties to the conflict. So when you turn into Russia Today, well, how is Russia involved in these cases of conflict in the former Soviet Union? And be mindful of the bias from that particular source. And so again, a lot of it is also kind of helping them understand who the parties are to the conflicts so that they can better evaluate what perspective the sources are going to be coming from.
Awesome, thanks. And then when you asked me, I wanted to ask you as well too, regarding like how the remote learning worked out for you this past year. Was there anything that you learned that you've done differently, even in person going forward because of that?
Yeah. So one thing I did in the remote learning was I had students, I dedicated some class meetings to individual consultations on student writing. So if it's like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday course, then, as we're approaching a big deadline in the course, I would use, the day before that big deadline to set up times to meet with students on their writing. And the teaching assistants would do the same thing. And so we'd have kind of 10-minute consultations with students that students could sign up for via Canvas, and we'd meet with them to discuss their writing. And this I found has been particularly helpful for the upper division writing courses that have a heavy emphasis on students doing their own independent research, their own independent projects, because there's only so much you could answer about a project or an assignment that's general and applies to everybody. At a certain point, students have very individual, very particular questions about their own projects, their own writing that they want to be able to ask. During the pandemic, people's schedules were all over the place. And so my courses were synchronous. And so, at least a certain portion of people could be available at that time. And so using class time for these individual consultations, I found were much more helpful than office hours, where students may not be available during my office hours. Maybe they had other courses, they had, again, childcare issues or what have, sibling care issues. And what have you. And so, at least dedicating, again, kind of right before big deadlines, some class time to be able to meet with students was hugely helpful. I found kind of moving forward, kind of taking that into the in-person classroom environment, that those meetings are still hugely helpful for, again, the writing courses. They're not as helpful for the courses that have writing assignments that are not independent research projects. And the students in those classes, I found that it's much more efficient, a much more efficient use of time to kind of just tackle students' general questions, because the prompts are the same for the writing assignments, are the same for all students. Generally, what I'm looking for is the same from all students. And so I wouldn't do those individual consultations moving forward in those types of classes. But again, in classes where students are doing their own kind of independent projects, I found that to be hugely helpful.
Thanks.
Well, we are almost out of time here. That hour just flew by. I want to allow for any other questions from our participants. A couple of you have used the chat box, but this will be a final opportunity to pick the brains of these two very seasoned writing instructors. Any further thoughts from the participants? Well, with that, I think I'm going to thank both of you so much for investing your time. I know that you also got to know one another a little better through this webinar, and did some exchange of information in advance, which I think really helped with the presentation today. So thank you both for your time. Thank you all for coming. Please send any suggestions for future webinars my way, and we'll see if we can recruit folks to spend their time sharing their own experiences. So Bill and Caitlin, once again, appreciate what you're doing for the school, and appreciate your coming out today. Thanks all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Janet.
thank you for dedicating your time on a Friday.
Yeah, right. And
thank you, everyone else.
This recording will be available on the social science website in a few days usually. So.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, Caitlin.
Great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you all. Be well.
Okay.